I want to talk to you a little bit about immigration and child refugees. How widespread a problem? What are the numbers? What is the scope of what we're talking about now?
In our report, which we issued last year, estimated that about 127,000 children would enter the U.S. in 2016, and these include about 37,500 refugees. So they're actually a minority of the total, the others being children who cross the border of the U.S. either unaccompanied or in the company of one or more family members.
When you're talking about these kids, is there a differentiation where they come from, how they come into the country?
The refugees come from a number of different countries. Of course, the bulk of the refugees actually come from the Middle East, at least as of last year, but also from Africa. But the unaccompanied children and the other children that I mentioned who make up the majority of immigrants to the U.S. in 2016 were children from Central America, fleeing often very horrendous conditions of poverty, violence, gang involvement, that kind of thing. So the experiences of these children in reaching the U.S. they're very similar to that of refugees in that they're fleeing a really dangerous set of situations, a very violent kind of environment. So they've really faced a lot of trauma even before they get to the U.S.
And do we know roughly how many unaccompanied children do fall into that category?
So that would be approximately 90,000 on an annual basis. And of course, those numbers fluctuate up and down on year to year, but as of 2016, that was our estimate.
When you were a child, a minor coming without an adult
Yes.
into this country, where do you go?
Good question.
Where do you find shelter?
Right.
Where do you find help?
Well, if you're apprehended at the border, if you're from Mexico, you're pretty much right away turned around and sent back to Mexico. If you're not from Mexico or Canada, you are first in the custody of customs and immigration officials, placed in detention facilities. That's supposed to be a short time stay, but the U.S. System has been overwhelmed in recent years by these numbers, and one of our concerns is that there are significant numbers of children and family members who are in these detention facilities while they're awaiting further disposition. And they're really not set up at all to be child friendly. They're really more like prison kinds of settings, and it's very concerning that they have these conditions which are not really considered adequate for good child development.
What are the ages of the kids coming over?
Well, I'm sure some of them are infants if they come over with a family member who can carry them, but so they're all ages really from infancy to teenage.
Can you speak a little bit about what's happening to these children? What kind of things they're going through that are impacting them?
Well, typically children in these situations will feel a great deal of fear and anxiety. Some of that fear and anxiety may center around being separated from their family members. Either the separation might have occurred even before they left their home, but it also they may be worried if they came to the detention center with a family member that they'll be separated from him or her. Children, especially young children, that attachment bond between a young child and his or her primary caregiver is very strong, and when it's threatened, it can be very damaging to early child development. These children can experience a great deal of stress that affects their physical health, their mental health, can lead to behavior problems, sleep problems, eating problems. And in certain extreme cases, the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So you have a situation where young children typically, as I said, even before they get to the border, have been exposed to very stressful conditions, and then they're re-traumatized when they get to this country because they're met with essentially a police force who puts them into a detention facility, and it's really a very harsh and scary situation for a young child.
What is the impact of having this number of children undergoing this kind of trauma?
Well, I think that it's it remains to be seen. Obviously, if these children, or even some of these children, end up remaining in the United States, we're going to be faced with the task of helping them to integrate and to become healthy and happy individuals. If they're sent back to their home countries, many of them fear for their lives, because that's why they left in the first place, is they felt they had no other way to for self-preservation than to flee. So I think, regardless of what happens, we're looking at some long-term repercussions from this kind of experience. And I think that for that reason alone, we would want to try to minimize the additional stress that these children have to undergo once they're here.
What can families do when they are reunited with these kids? What kinds of steps should they be taking?
Well, there are a number of things that can happen. Some children who come to this country already have family members here, are preceding them as having come to this country, and they can try to reunite with them. In fact, often that's a motivation for who comes to this country, is to reunite with a family member who's already established themselves in the United States. In what we have in many cases is you have a family group, some members of whom may be U.S. citizens or authorized immigrants with green cards, and others who may be unauthorized. And so one of the difficulties for families is knowing that one or more family members' security and stability within that family unit is in jeopardy if their unauthorized status is discovered, and they could be deported. And of course, that would be very traumatic for the family, not only in terms of losing that contact with that family member, but losing the family income associated with that member, and a whole host of problems that we know happen when families are broken up. Now, if you're talking about what can communities do in the broader sense, many people in this country recognize that we're a country that was founded on immigration and on immigrants fleeing difficult situations and seeking new opportunities in this country. And for that reason, there are a number of groups. Some of them run through churches or other religious organizations, and others through other civic groups that have mobilized to support families, to support refugee families, either once they've arrived in this country, or even through international aid organizations that help refugees who are maybe still in a refugee camp somewhere in the world. We know that this whole problem of people displaced from their home countries is at worldwide record levels right now. About 65 million people have been displaced worldwide, and those numbers are higher than they've been at any time since the Second World War. So it's very much a worldwide problem. But people here in the United States can do lots of things. They can give aid to families who are establishing themselves within their communities. They can also educate themselves on the services and supports that all families under our Constitution are entitled to. So, for instance, regardless of where a child is born or their legal status, they have access to free public education. And so it's important to know what the rights are of children and other family members who are immigrants. There's also been some specific resource guides prepared for teachers who work in educational settings, and for early child care professionals who work in child care kinds of settings, about, again, what the legal rights are, whether they need, whether they're obligated to release records about children or let in law enforcement agents who may be looking to find and deport people who are in this country without authorization. I think those are very helpful guides about how to minimize the threat to children's well-being that could be posed by unannounced raids or other kinds of threatening measures that might be taken.
Are there other services that these kids are eligible for that they're not getting, and why not?
Right. Well, children who've received official have been officially designated as refugees are eligible for pretty much all the services that that a U.S.-born child would be eligible for. But those children who do not have official refugee status are really not eligible for many services beyond that free public education. So they won't be eligible for food stamps. They won't be eligible for medical insurance. They won't be eligible for welfare payments. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that in this recent climate of anxiety around some of the new policies around deportation and some of the rhetoric around immigration, that families with even one family member who's unauthorized may be reluctant to kind of step outside into the public square and apply, or even, go to service centers, to whether it's a child care center or a food stamp center, and receive the benefits that they're eligible for, because they're afraid that by doing so they'll bring that family to the attention of authorities, and it will jeopardize the safety of one or more family members who's not authorized. So I think what happens is that even children who are innocent in terms of their own status, they're U.S. citizens often, because most children in immigrant families were born here in the U.S. and by that reason are legally U.S. citizens, may be denied access to services because their parents are afraid, or other family members are afraid, that if they come out of the shadows, so to speak, and seek either for their children or for themselves those kinds of benefits, that it might jeopardize the status of the one or two family members who may be here illegally.
Progressively, these numbers are getting bigger. Where do we stand this year as opposed to 5 years ago?
Well, it's really been up and down a lot. So it's very difficult to predict the direction that it'll be going. What we've seen is that the actual immigration of children and family members from Mexico has pretty much declined to about zero in terms of net migration. There's many Mexicans coming back from this country as there are trying to get into this country. What we're seeing still is large numbers of children from this area of Central America, the Central American countries where this problem of poverty and violence is especially great. And of course, anecdotally, we're hearing through news stories that word has gotten out that the United States may not be as welcoming a place for refugees and immigrants as it has been at other times, and so people are looking at alternatives, and so we may be seeing fewer people coming to our borders for that reason as well. So it's very, very difficult to predict. It depends not only on conditions as they're perceived in our country, but of course in conditions in their home countries. And if things get a little more settled in their home countries, and if people feel safer, then they may be more willing to stick it out there.
You had mentioned more immigrants from the Middle East?
Yes. So for the first time, really last year, in 2016, the Obama administration decided to admit significant numbers of Syrian refugees. Prior to that time, those numbers had really been very small, certainly in comparison with the number of Syrian refugees that had been admitted by many of the countries in Europe. So over 10,000 Syrian refugees were admitted in 2016, and probably at least half of them were children. And the refugee resettlement program of the United States has always been, to a degree, driven by political considerations as well as humanitarian considerations. So there have been efforts to use as part of the criteria for admitting refugees has been what's in the national security interest of the United States. And so we've often given preferential treatment to refugees from countries who have been our partners. Like after the Vietnam War, we admitted hundreds of thousands of refugees from South Vietnam. We did the same thing when there were a lot of refugees fleeing Cuba. And so it's always been a somewhat selective process. I know we've also admitted significant numbers of refugees from Afghanistan and from Iraq. As well as from some of the countries of South Asia, so Bhutan, Nepal, and so on.
Why is it important that you keep an eye on the numbers? Why is it important to you to see where those trends are
Sure.
and what we're facing?
Sure. Well, I think, from our perspective at Child Trends, children are a vulnerable group by definition, but there are certain subgroups of children who are even more vulnerable, and certainly refugees and immigrants are one group of children that I think face significant additional vulnerabilities, and we want to make sure that that as communities absorb however many the numbers turn out to be for their community, that those children and their families are given a good start in life, because we know that when the needs of young children are left unaddressed early in childhood, that often the price for that we pay later as a community for having all of our citizens be productive and engaged can be a lot higher than if we'd addressed some of the issues earlier on, giving kids a good start so that they can go on to achieve and contribute back to their communities. We've seen that as part of the history of the United States, that when immigrants successfully integrate, they do give back many times over what they've received, but that if that early experience is compromised by fear and anxiety and trauma, then we're likely just to see a whole set of problems that communities will have to pay for through increased health care and public assistance and those kinds of, we'll see individuals having to be dependent rather than contributing members of society.
Is there anything that I did not ask you that you think is really important for people to take away?
It would be well for people, I think, across our country to become familiar with the history of of immigration in our country and how it has contributed to the strength of our nation, and to realize, as I said, this is a worldwide problem. No one's singling out the United States for all the burdens and challenges of integrating refugees. Most countries around the world are facing the same challenges, and I think if we can set a positive example, we'll be well served.
And what was the total number of
refugees? The total number was 127,000 combined. So refugees, accompanied children, unaccompanied children.
A little bit about your position. What is it that you look at?
I manage the indicators area and the data bank. So the data bank is an online resource of over 120 indicators of child well-being. So everything from child poverty to teenage pregnancy to child maltreatment, high school graduation, the kinds of measures that we want to look at if we care about how kids are doing.
This particular area, how do you label this?
Indicators. But because my interests are broad, I tend to get involved in projects at Child Trends that are cross-cutting. So we take a special look at an issue topic like children who are refugees or immigrants. I did an earlier report on, for instance, children who have an incarcerated parent and the effects of that on their experience. So my interest is really on looking at issues that cut across education, health, other aspects of well-being.
What do these kids need to succeed?
A sense of stability, a sense of security, to feel safe physically and emotionally. They need the same things really that children all over the world need. They need safe, secure, stable caregivers. They need their basic needs for food, shelter, and clothing to be met. They need a nurturing environment that provides adequate intellectual stimulation. So children in general are very resilient, but they do have certain minimal requirements that really must be met if they're going to do well.
The fear of deportation or having a family member deported, how much of a specter is that in everyday life for these kids?
What we hear anecdotally is that it's very much present in their lives and is interfering with their school attendance, interfering with their health in terms of sleep problems, anxiety, depression. It's difficult for someone, I think, who hasn't experienced that to really understand what it must be like to live in daily fear that a family member is going to drop out of your life.
What's your area of expertise?
My area of expertise at Child Trends is indicators. Indicators meaning all kinds of measures that we use to track and monitor the well-being of kids.
Can you tell me where you did your training?
At the University of Michigan.
And where was your master's?
Also at the University of Michigan.
And undergrad?
Also at University of Michigan.
What was your area of study?
For the doctoral program, it was developmental psychology. Then I also have a master's degree in early childhood education.